Welcome back for another panel on the Greetings Earthling program. My name is Ian Edwards. I'm producer and host. Make sure you tune in for all of our sessions. Climate justice, racial discord, poverty, hunger, these are tragic social issues that will only get more vivid as we go further into the climate crisis. The ideas of sociology and anthropology are changing as we begin to reckon with planetary justice. What does it mean to be human in the midst of a climate threat when we're also challenged by social threats? We're joined by an environmental sociologist in the UK, a writer anthropologist in Stockholm, and an artist anthropologist in New York City to debate how societal strata are evolving. Before we get started, a special thank you to our critical and ongoing sponsors and private donors. As you know, Broto Art Climate Science is a program of the Cape Cod Center for Sustainability, which is a registered 501c3 charity. We have done this program online and for free. But that means we have to rely on our attendees to support us financially, especially for us tiny nonprofits in the COVID era when funding has evaporated. If you can help us, even with a small donation in support of this program and future art-sci initiatives by Broto, please click the link in the pop-up. Now, on with our panel inspired by global citizenship. Thank you for watching. Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to Broto Art Climate Science and our latest conference. This one's called Greetings Earthling. What is global citizenship? What is the art science lens of the human scale in the midst of the climate crisis? We're welcoming people from all over the world, including panelists this year. So we are global more than ever. This is panel number 2, what we called Climate Casts. It's one of 8 panels that we have on the program this weekend. I wondered in producing this if in the face of the climate crisis, society was evolving in ways that reflect the climate crisis, if it and where it falls among our other societal conflicts. So to help us with this, we're looking at some sociology and anthropology and art. Here to explore the subject is environmental sociologist Stacia Ryder from the University of Exeter in southern UK. We have artist and anthropologist Ayodamola Okunseinde, who is a New York artist, previous contributor to the Broto conferences, and an anthropologist, PhD candidate now I hear, and writer and anthropologist Ella Hillström, who is beaming in from Stockholm. So first of all, thank you to our panelists and thank you for joining us here. Before we get started, I just wanted to set a baseline. When we think about the state of environmental justice or climate justice, Stacia, what are we talking about in current terms?
Environmental justice has evolved as a concept and as a movement since the early 1980s, and it tends to focus on sort of 3 primary dimensions, and that is distributive justice, procedural justice, and recognition justice. Some people may be quite familiar with those terms and others not so much, but basically it has to do with the distribution of environmental goods and bads, as well as the ability for people to participate and have meaningful influence over decision-making processes, environmental decision-making processes that influence them. And then also for people and their cultures to be properly recognized within those decision-making processes. We've seen a lot of sort of sections of justice develop over time. So climate justice, energy justice, water justice, things like that. And now we're seeing a more critical approach develop, focusing on things like decolonizing environmental justice, intersectional approaches to environmental justice, and things like that. So that's sort of the direction where things are going, thinking about justice pluralistically and contextually across time and space, and with real considerations of power dynamics within those.
Have we evolved our ideas of social strata in light of the climate crisis? What's different?
That's a tough question. I don't know if I don't know if we have. I think that we are. I think it's evident that we haven't because we are coming across conflicts as a result of that. So yeah, the answer to that, I don't think that I think that we are starting to realize that we need to have a reevaluation of these um, constructs, right? We need to have a real evaluation of what societal cohesion is. We need to have a reevaluation of what humanity is, right, to address all of these. And I'm particularly interested in how we come about those reconfigurations, not only societally, but also how does technology play an impact in that? So thinking about how does digital technologies and the notion of democratization of technologies, what does that play in formation of societal cohesion, and how does that impact environmentally as well?
Ella, has the anthropology changed in light of the climate crisis as a school of thought?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the anthropology of the multi-species is more present than ever. Of what does it mean to no longer centralize the human as a main agent? That has become massive. What does a non do in the non-human, in the non-white, and the so on? That is super central, and it's always been present. But I think now we have to really interrogate ourselves. And in some ways, anthropology has always been about studying extinction, about studying those who are soon to die. And now we're kind of facing ourselves. The anthropologists are facing their own deaths. So we have to, I think, environmental justice and anthropology has a lot to do with death in that way.
How charming.
Yeah, great.
So fun. Well, it's true. I mean, obviously, I wondered, Stacia, sociology is, and forgive my layman's terms, we're stratified by things like race or gender or economic class. Are those definitions changing relative to the climate crisis?
Well, I think those constructs are fluid, right, across time and space. And I think that that's really important to recognize. But I also think that, unfortunately, we're seeing some of the same long-standing patterns of social inequality, which transforms into environmental inequality, that now is becoming climate inequality. And so you can trace these sort of inequalities back, centuries, not just decades. I was reflecting on this today, thinking about some work I did looking at the gold rush in California, for example, right? And you can, and people do, think about settler colonialism as an environmental injustice in and of itself. The removal of people from their land, from water, the uprooting of cultural relationships there. But then in particular, in the context of gold mining, there were policies put in place, taxes to try and push out Mexican workers that were working there, violence and murder against Native Americans that were early workers in some of the gold mines. And then precursors to the Chinese Exclusion Act were really rooted in the gold rush. And so I was thinking about that, and then jumping forward and thinking about it and reflecting what Ella and Ayo said, is this idea of necropolitics, right? That the government can decide who is worth, saving, whose lives are valuable. And this applies to humans and non-humans. And I think we've seen some of that play out in the current pandemic. And that is a real fear in terms of what patterns we might see as the climate crisis continues to worsen.
You mentioned the pandemic, which we've been using, or I've been saying, is a rehearsal for the climate crisis. And Ayo or Ella, how is social stratification or anthropology or our idea of being human affected by the COVID crisis that might also reflect us in the climate crisis?
Yeah, I'd like to touch on that a little. When we say the COVID crisis, right? The COVID crisis is not just a COVID crisis, right? It's also it's a symptom of other crises, right? So I think that, I think about, Stacia was talking about the gold rush and, the environmental catastrophe of that, and the fact that that sort of is about a colonial mentality. Thinking about digital colonialism too as something akin to that, and thinking about, yes, during the time of the pandemics, we rely on technologies to sort of get us through that. But at the same time that we were relying on those technologies as well are negatively, they have externalities that affect certain groups. So it's really all intricately woven in a web of destruction, unfortunately.
I do want to get into three sort of specific sections of the topic. But before that, Ella, I just want to, as our European panelist, is there something different that's happening in the European community that would be perhaps different than what we're experiencing here in the US?
I think just the fact that we haven't at all been able to provide as many vaccine doses has been a really interesting way of for me to reflect on, like, the US and these maybe older structures that Europe is relying on, like the EU, and there's more bureaucracy around how do we redistribute this, and it takes a longer time then. But I think, yeah, I mean, barely 5% in Sweden have been vaccinated at this point. And yet there were debates around whether or not we were managing the crisis for good or worse. We had quite a unique approach in kind of the live freely but under responsibility. So there was no lockdown and so on. But now maybe we'll just have a longer prolonged COVID period anyways. So yeah, there are definitely different responses, and I think they rely on different institutions and different histories.
Interesting. So in sociology and climatology, we were in prepping this panel. We talked about three specific areas, and I wanted to start with intergenerational justice. One of the things that we do here at Broto is we often look at the long term or future generations, acknowledging the obligation we have to make choices for them today. So what is intergenerational justice, and what is our society imperative to protect future generations? Anybody want to start?
I could start on that. We talk about we talk a lot about. So I'm coming from this from a Yoruba person, where the idea of intergenerational connections is very, very strong, ancestral and sort of progeny. And we talk a lot about, what we owe our ancestors and how our ancestors have, given us life. But in a way, I feel that we owe more to future generations than our ancestors, because future generations give us the will to live. If one thinks about, if let's say, for everybody here, if you knew that in a week's time, everybody that you loved was going to be dead, what motivation does one have? How does one act? So I think a lot, we owe a lot to those future generations. In fact, I think probably more than I don't want to say more, but similarly to what we owe ancestors.
Ella, Stacia, do you want to comment on that? What's our obligation?
I think I'll step in. I think one part that, and going back to the social stratification question, is just really hearing and listening to those who have been considered unlearned or don't have the tools to understand difficult, complex questions. I mean, the children are the ones who are paving way for this movement in many ways, and I really enjoy how that disrupts hierarchies between what it means to have gone through life and to acquire knowledge, and then we have these really sharp voices who are telling us, and in some ways you can draw connections to the indigenous who have also been paving the way for a long time, but who have been disregarded. So yeah, I think we definitely owe it to them, but they've also been speaking for quite a long time now. So.
Stacia, I know that you've been talking about this a little bit, but there's quite a bit of new resonance and indigenous knowledge when it comes to these aspects of understanding sociology and the climate crisis. I'm just wondering if you can add anything about that into this.
Yeah, I think I want to build just really briefly and then turn to that. I think one of the key components of intergenerational justice, as we've been conceptualizing it, comes back to that distributive imbalance and that approach to justice, which when we talk about climate injustice, we often talk about distributive injustice across spaces, particularly global north and global south, and sort of who's responsible for getting us here, right? We call it the Anthropocene, but we know that not every single person holds the same responsibility for getting us here. And I think you can say the same, right, across generations. And that is, folks living now may be reaping more benefits from some of the destructive practices that we've engaged in or people before us have engaged in, but future generations that aren't necessarily going to benefit from that will disproportionately be shouldering those burdens. So I think that's really something to keep in mind as we frame it. But I also think from indigenous perspectives, and this maybe bleeds into one of the other topics that we'll talk about, but there's a different approach to temporality and a different way of thinking and framing the sort of urgency of climate change that we've talked about. And so in terms of cross generations, Christine Winter uses the Maori conceptualization of time to talk about really being time not being linear, right? Instead being spiral, and her sort of existing and all of us both concurrently as future generations and as living beings and as our ancestors. And so time is wrapped up in conceptualized in quite a different way that has implications for how we might think about justice across different generations.
You mentioned the word temporality. I just wanted to get a definition for our audience. Ayo, you want to give us a spelling lesson or a grammar lesson?
Yeah, I'm going to speak about temporality in the way that I understand it, which is the way one understands time with respect to one's community or one space. So, for example, having a job as a computer programmer, right? You might experience time differently than, let's say, if you had a job as a construction worker, right? The different ways you move through your day. So it's not only about the individual too, right? It's also about the community. So for example, as an African American, what does the history of being African American in America mean to me in terms of time? And then one could also think about Black time, Black temporal studies, thinking about how is time constructed, and how do communities live within those constructs of time in different geographic spaces. And one of the things that I'm investigating is how colonialism, capitalism constructs a particular type of time, and this hegemonic time that we all live in. But that time is not necessarily that time oppresses. With capitalism, it creates new spaces for extraction, right? And so certain bodies may be oppressed within those systems, may be taken advantage of in those systems. So then how do those bodies create their own time to exist? How do they reject the hegemonic temporality? or how do they use that hegemonic temporality as a way to create new understandings and new spaces for them and their progeny?
So it's so interesting. One of the things that I've been trying to consider is a chronic versus acute understanding of climate. I mean, it seems that the crisis sort of thrums in the background, sort of low stress, and other issues in society are more acute, therefore they take more attention. And they have to act fast. So I see that race and climate are relevant to this idea of temporality. We talk about Black extinction versus white extinction, and I wondered if you could set that up for us in terms of a concept for our audience.
Yeah, I think Ayo actually was the one who was elaborating on those particular terms. But I guess what I would say and add to that is we see and hear about the climate crisis primarily through the white lens, right? And this is sort of the first time that white people have faced this sort of degree of crisis and threat. At the same time, over our histories, Native people, Indigenous people, Black people, particularly in America is the context that I'm most familiar with, have faced these ecological crises and threats to their bodies, again, for centuries. So this isn't necessarily something new. And the idea that, living on the planet requires constant adaptation to your environment is really embedded in indigenous practices and cultures. And so we can think about what does the climate crisis look like from outside of that white lens? Is it a crisis? And I think, Ayo, I think maybe has more to say on the Black versus white extinction distinction.
Yeah, I mean, the Black body in America has historically been put under that stress. Yeah, you say ecological, but also on the body. And the question of yes, now we have this climate crisis, and yes, the whole world, we need to address it. But then there's also a feeling of, well, we also have to address extinction of the Black body. And how do we, do we address climate extinction as it relates to climate? First, do we address extinction as it relates to Black bodies first? Where do we sit within that? Yeah, I don't have an answer to that, but it's definitely something that is frustrating, and it's troubling to see so much effort go into climate change. Oh, we have to act now, right? And at the same time, you see Black bodies just being killed, and there is no urgency. And when we talk about temporality there too, is like there's this urgency of, okay, right now climate, right? But then when it comes to Black bodies in America, it's just like, well, the rest, that's the time that the Black body lives under, right? That the rest of pressures from the state.
You had mentioned that the Black Lives Matter movement was very much like an eco movement. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Oh, I think that was Stacia that had made a connection there. I think she might be more better suited to answer that question.
Stacia?
Sure, yeah. I was pointing to the work of David Pellow, who is one of the sort of prominent folks in environmental justice research. And, he suggests, as we take on a more critical approach to environmental justice, that when we step back and we look at the sort of underlying causes of police brutality and discrimination against Black people and brown people in America, and we look at environmental justice, which is rooted in environmental racism, where low-income communities and communities of color face higher risks of exposure to environmental toxins. He suggests that in many of these cases, at the root of them is state-sanctioned violence. And so if we really focus our lens on how power and privilege operate and how the state backs these activities, then we can see the sort of interconnectedness across them. And I guess I would suggest, I'm not sure if we have to have an either or. Do we focus on, for example, Black extinction, or do we focus on climate change? But I do think that environmentalism and not necessarily the climate justice movement, but folks who are concerned with climate change need to do a better job of connecting some of these other very important issues and committing themselves to those if they want to sort of grow their own coalition. And I think that's really important.
Interesting. Ella, you had mentioned multi-species justice. You know, we have these legal precedents in the world with giving aspects of nature legal standing in a court of law. Do you have any thoughts on that? What it means to be a non-human in a society?
Well, if we would know, then that's a point that we don't know. But I actually, I was thinking about this word planetary justice, and I was thinking about Lynn Margulis' concept of the symbiosis.
Right.
She's a biologist who kind of goes against the Darwinian survival of the fittest, or neo-Darwinian survival of the fittest concept, and instead talks about these unexpected organisms that merge together and create new forms of life. And so symbiosis is when two agents co-live together and benefit from each other. And that kind of can serve as a future model. But she does end her book with thinking about the planetary, like beyond Earth. And I kind of like to think about that as well, of in some ways, we are only, when we're talking about the Anthropocene, I mean, it is also just us or this planet. I would like to understand more how we are in relation to planetary forces, I mean, it's all about trying to take in as much as we can in understanding how we are relational beings. So that's what I think about when I think about planetary justice. I think about this like more outer space, and what does that mean to be in something larger than that?
Stacia, Stacia, what's the research on planetary justice, or what's the work going into this kind of thought?
Yeah, so it's a relatively new concept that's being developed, and it does relate to and stem from all of these other justices that we've talked about. But I think where it sort of distinguishes itself is it does take a planetary level approach, right? And it focuses on justice within the planet as a socio-ecological system, right? So in some ways it draws on the natural sciences, and it moves beyond the sort of anthropomorphism, the anthropocentrism, excuse me, of some of the early conceptualizations of justice. So it's really it acknowledges that justice is contextual, and it's important to think about it across scales, but it really, I think, suggests that we can't remove, we need to conceptualize justice at this planetary level, even if we're thinking about it at more micro scales than just the planet, that needs to be sort of front and center. So I think that will be, and it's focused on global change, right? That is, I think, part of the goal of working on planetary justice. So I think there's a lot to be seen of what will come out of that developing approach.
It always struck me as odd that the human animal doesn't see him or herself or themselves as part of the dwindling biodiversity of this planet, that there's something separate about the human animal versus the other animals. And I don't know if society is the key to give us that kind of sense of superiority, or not, but it seems like an odd mismatch. Ayo, any thoughts on multi-species justice before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with your statement. I think that the human animal does have the capacity to sort of see themselves as the dwindling. If you think about indigenous communities, I think it's the indigenous communities that try to more equitably live within the system, the nature, right? But I think it's maybe the construction of the human, which is an abstract thing, that causes humans not to be able to see that, right? So if one then thinks about reconstructing the human, one might be able to see how one might be able to live within the system. And I think we have the capacity to do both, to construct the human in this negative fashion, right? But also construct the human in this positive fashion. And I always look to the works of Octavia Butler in that regard, talking about hierarchy, multi-species, living, planetary justice, politics, all of that within her work. And I think art, in terms of speculative design, Afrofuturism, design fiction stuff, allows us to sort of broaden our view. But particularly that the Octavia Butler's work is like ripe on all of this and right on point.
You sort of preempted my last question, which was about what it means to be a human, or what is the definition of a human in the new climate crisis. Ella, do you want to give that a shot? What's your definition of a human?
I really love this question, I have to say. I think this is the most important question. I think this is all about this relational shift. And I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but for me, it's to be human is to it's about love, to love in a self-forgetting manner, to kind of try and see how we can find relationships with things that appear unfamiliar or that appear distant to us. And to recognize, to see ourselves in unexpected organisms, to see that I have microbacteria in myself and therefore I'm part of fungi, or to kind of recognize those things, I think is how we have to redefine the human today.
Stacia, do you want to give a definition of human in climate crisis?
It's a tall order.
Go for it.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have a definition per se, but I think something that I was starting to touch on a little bit too is, again, if we think about rethinking our place within the broader ecosystem. Kyle Powys-White also does a lot of indigenous work on climate change, and he talks about the mutual responsibilities that humans have within sort of the broader ecosystem in our relationship with non-humans. And I think that's something that is becoming increasingly more prevalent in these conversations about what it means to be human in this current climate time. I also think that, obviously there is a shared experience of climate change, but I think something that is said frequently and is maybe a little too simplified, but still gets at this point, is that, we may be in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat, right? And I do think that as we think about what it means to be human in all of this, that is something that needs to be central to how we move forward.
Yeah, I was looking up a very simple definition of humanity and what are the human qualities from the earliest times, and it was empathy, compassion, and unconditional love. And frankly, I don't see a lot of that in today's society. It's so conflated with other things that it's difficult to find that humanity. So I'm appreciative of your struggles for definitions. We have a couple of minutes. I just wanted to touch on art. since we have a lot of people in our community who are artists. I mean, how is the sociology of climatology showing up in art?
Yeah, I think actually Ella could also answer this question because we've done a project using slime mold, sort of thinking about, we work together on different projects, thinking about how slime mold, the growth of slime mold how could we work with slime mold? How could we be collaborators with slime mold to understand humanity better? But also in terms of not only, so thinking about communities, right? Um, not only human and non-human communities, right, but also human communities. So thinking about artists and how are they affected by borders, for example, how they're affected by shifting political landscapes, and so bringing all these making projects out of all of these things, artistic projects that are research based, that are collaborative, that are participatory. I think surfaces, it tries to get at an elusive part of what it is to be human now, what it is to contend with all these issues that we have now through an artistic perspective.
One of the ideas that Broto has challenged over the last few years since we got started was this idea of scale, and how do we make a climate remedy at scale, at planet scale. And I've always pointed to art as the channel that transcends borders and sociology and other kinds of issues that are obstacles in other places, and that art could be a great distribution channel for some of these ideas. Ella, do you want the last word on what art is doing for the climate when it comes to sociology or anthropology?
Yeah, I think we really need to be creative now, and we need to create collaborations, understand how to bridge communities, but also how to create new modes of sensitivities. How can we relate differently? So I would look for an art world that's not so focused on productivity and the I, but rather a we. That's what I'm looking for.
Excellent. Stacia, last thing?
I mean, I guess just a couple of things. I think, art and music as well have historically been tied to forms of oppression, experiencing it, resisting it, pushing back on it. And I think that art and music can continue to help us rethink our relationship with the environment, with the climate, with the planet even. And I was thinking today, what's great about art is that creativity that Ella touched on. And I think if we can envision it, right, through art, through music, then perhaps in practice we can create it. And I think that's really exciting.
Yes, I'm going to get a T-shirt that says, "If we can't build it, if we don't imagine it," which is a great mantra, I think, from our work here. I want to say thank you. We're going to wrap up this portion of the hour. We're going to pop up in a couple of seconds to answer questions for the attendees. I invite everybody who's listening in to check out the web portal for more information on our speakers. And I will say goodbye for now, and we'll see you in a couple of seconds. Thank you to our panel, and we'll see you in just a nanosecond. Hello, everyone. We are in the live portion of our hour. So this is an opportunity for our attendees to ask their questions, and we can continue our conversation with our panelists. It's been several weeks since we actually recorded that, and I'm wondering, Stacia or Ella or Ayo, if you've had any sort of thoughts after watching that and the time that's intervened.
Also,
People are being polite.
Just FYI.
Stacia, why don't you start us?
Well, I guess I've been working on a paper that's really focused on exploring how power creates injustices as it manifests through time, space, and scale, right? And so some of that gets at some of the temporalities and things that we were talking about, and how Ella mentioned, you know, anthropologists facing their own death and things like that. So, yeah, I guess just building on what we talked about is just thinking about the role of power in how we think about and experience time, space, and scale, and how time, space, and scale can be mechanisms through which power can operate in a society. Just so, for example, thinking about some work that I do here in the UK on shale gas communities, and one community in particular has a really long history of coal mining in the area, and so some folks there see themselves as a sort of historical sacrifice zone, and then that continued legacy through other resource extraction processes. So that's what I've been spending a lot of time thinking about the last several weeks since we last spoke.
Yeah, I've been, I've been thinking about. So I have a piece that tries to accelerate time in a way. It uses images from police videos of Black bodies being killed, and it generates new images, right? And in so doing, it basically uses a technology of surveillance using machine learning to sort of accelerate these new images in a way, trying to exhaust all possibilities. And then it tries to interpret, or tries to reason as to what images the machine is generating. And over the last few weeks, I've been thinking about how that too ties into ecology, that the computer, the machine learning aspect of it, the energy consumption of that, is detrimental to the environment. But there's something interesting about the piece still, that it is calling attention to extinction, right? At the same time, it's sort of promulgating extinction. So I'm still trying to wrestle as to what all of that means. But the recent stuff with all the NFTs and the Bitcoins and Ethereum and stuff has drawn my attention to that recently.
I just wanted to ask the panel a question from the chat box. Can the panelists consider the possibility that changing the kind of thinking that brought us to the climate crisis, somebody just did this, can also address the kind of thinking behind myriad forms of injustice and oppression? In other words, the immediate problems of injustice, xenophobia, etc., will be ameliorated by default if we get our Earthling mindset right. Does this resonate? If we think like Earthlings, will we fix all these problems? Ella, you haven't had a chance to weigh in on this.
Yeah, it's such a difficult question, because I think we were touching on that before, of like what is a crisis, which bodies are in crisis, what focus do we need to have, and if I'm understanding the question correctly, like I think. How do we try and see the interconnections? We try and build the bridges in between these different forms of oppression, see similarities, but also really focus on the specificities, because we can't just lose the specific struggles that these different minorities or different issues are experiencing. So I think that's a constant struggle of generalizing, with the risk that a we will emerge that is that kind of assumes whiteness, the patriarchy, and so on. I don't know if that makes sense, but you know I'll just stop there. Sorry. I do that. Thanks.
Ayo, do you have any thoughts on that? If we are Earthlings, we will fix our problems.
If that happens, we'll be out of the job, or I'll be out of the job, right? I would like to think so, but that's a utopian dream, right? And utopia is not an existent thing. I would like to think about, like these issues are this idea of sort of eliminating these injustices. I don't think it'll ever happen. I think all of this, these are all discursive topics, right? That even in a world where everything is perfect in a utopia, right? The problem then becomes everything is perfect. So I think it's really about, as discursive topics, and as we try to resolve or try to make things more equitable, we do that the best we can, but I don't think we'll ever feel as if we are there. There will always be work to do. And I think that that's really something exciting about being a human being, and the thing that we find palatable now may not be palatable 100 years from now, right? And then we have to rework the definitions and rework what that means, right? Yeah, I find that really fascinating about humans.
I wanted to, so we have an expert in our community watching us, Diego. Thanks for all your perspectives and questions. He's got one for Stacia. How do you see perspectives from sciences influencing your research on power and injustice?
Yeah, so I'm going to just briefly touch on what we were just talking about, and then I'll come back to that. I just wanted to also add on that I think about, well, I've been doing a lot of work looking at climate, energy, and environmental justice, which are all sort of literatures and subfields of their own. But there are some folks that are calling for those to be brought closer together, and they emphasize like unity, but not uniformity, right? And so I think the Earthling mindset, I think, yes, we should all think about ourselves collectively in such a way, but there still has to be that awareness that we aren't all the same and we're not experiencing some of these issues in all the same way. So I just wanted to add that in. And then in terms of perspectives from sciences and how it influences my research on power and injustice, I mean, I think we have to be honest that science itself has also been a tool used by powerful people for injustice to justify absolutely horrendous acts, right? And so science is a way of knowing, and it has brought us some very important insights and moved us forward, as humans, as humanity. But it also has its drawbacks, and it is not the only valid approach when it comes to ways of knowing, which is where we get into traditional ecological knowledge or local knowledges, which for example, can lead to more sustainable practices in conservation, in agriculture, in our relationships with the planet. And so I don't know if that's exactly what Diego is asking, but that's how I think about the more natural sciences as they relate to power and justice in the context of my work.
You're muted.
Thank you. Technology. I wanted to know if Ella or Ayo had any aspects of that question in their practice, the idea that the sciences would be influencing your perspectives on power and injustice.
I could speak a bit about mine, Ayo's project on how digital platforms are helping artists collaborate and create movements across location. And that's like a platform where technologies is really helping platforms, but then at the same time, the same technologies are selling their services to enforce harsher border controls. So there's a tension there, and there's a dialogue there that needs to be lifted up. So how can we both use and problematize at the same time? That's one example that I'm thinking about at the top of my mind.
I would like to get some time in on more on the art question, in that, you know, much of our audience is aligned with artists. These are people who are looking for legitimate footholds in the climate response, and that art is knowledge, is a theory or in a practice at Broto. So, you know, we see the power of imagery, like the George Floyd murals, or these aspects of, you know, design that show up and convey much more than just the language. Do we see a kind of addressing the injustice or the environmental planetary justice ideas that we're discussing here in art? Do we see that in art? Ayo?
Yeah, I think, well, I'm going to just talk a little bit about these words in relation to machine learning, for example, or in relation to AI stuff. And yes, there are artists that are doing work with that, the sort of questioning the power in these machine learning systems, for example, and questioning how those systems are connected to a legacy of oppression or legacy of colonialism, right? And I think in a way that is, it ties back to climate in that way, because the same forces that perpetuate these machines to then extract, to oppress, right, are the same systems that perpetuate extraction and destruction of the environment. So I think if one draws attention to, let's say, machine learning systems and the way they oppress, one is drawing attention to systems that are extractive and that are detrimental to the environment as well.
Ella, you're a writer. How are you synthesizing this issue in some of your writings?
For me, I've written one piece on contemplation as a tool to engage with the non-human, or to try and find new sensitivities. And what I often find with writing is that I want to combine it with other modalities, either weaving, if I'm writing a political piece, weaving the fiction in, how can we constantly be engaging with different ways of knowing, or can I end my piece with a somatic score that invites the reader to engage with the material in a different way. I worked with an animator to kind of illustrate what I've written differently. And so I think that's an experimentation I'm trying to do, of like, how do we use different forms of expressing ourselves together. So, yeah.
Stacia, do you have any, you touched on this a little bit in this session on the recording about the influence of art. You know, there's some questions about how other science is influencing your thoughts about power and injustice. I'm wondering if art is helping your science get better, more robust. Is it influencing your thoughts on power and injustice?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I mean, I think concepts like climate change are so difficult sometimes for people to grasp, that visual imagery can be so powerful in communicating some of the problems. And that goes for environmental injustice against people, but it's also true in terms of multi-species justice. So when we think about the images of plastic floating in the ocean, for example, or when you see like a bird's stomach a bird that's died and their stomach's just full of plastic. I think those are really powerful images. Or even it may be veering slightly off topic, but I was just out walking yesterday, and we've had really, really, really heavy rain here. And one of the fields that I've worked in that I didn't actually get to talk about much here is disaster work, but obviously disasters are very close to climate change. And so in the disaster world, people talk constantly about preparedness and resilience, and what does it mean to be able to withstand these extreme changes in climate. And so I just actually want to pull up a photo that I took yesterday, if that's okay, and show you I just saw this moment, and all I thought was, it just reminded me of the word resiliency, right? And that is something that people spend so much time trying to define. And I just thought, but that's it, And so I really think art helps us put our finger on things that we sometimes overcomplicate with our words. And I really appreciate that. So sorry, just give me 1 second and I will bring it up. Okay, so this is, I don't know how well there is, okay, so like I said, lots of rain, there's just been all of this flooding, but this swan built its nest with its egg high enough. It's the only thing that's not above the water, and that to me was just a really profound moment.
Well, thank you. I'm sensing we can reconvene in the post-panel room if people would like to go there now. I'm inviting everyone. Thank you to our guests for what is a complicated idea in a complicated time. And, as with all of our panels, we are trying to not necessarily answer the questions, but to ask better questions. So I'm going to say ciao for now. And if you're interested, please join us in the post-panel room, which we've set up specially for this. And there you go. That's that one wrapped. Thank you.
Thank you.